All right, gang, welcome back. We are solidly in November now. We are cruising for the home stretch. Hope everybody's not feeling too wild-eyed yet with the imminent onset of final exams and all that stuff. But we've got a bit less than a month plus some vacation weeks coming on, so we're going to move pretty fast through remaining classes of resources for our semester. And we spent a bunch of time, we kind of slowed down a little bit and worked through in some more detail and did a couple of field exercises with respect to soil resources, because a lot of these other resources, again, like we were saying last week and the week before, everything plugs into soils. We can't get away from soils management when we're talking about recreation resource protection. We just can't get away from it. Everything is either situated in the soil, grows out of the soil, and needs it to survive, or the soil is providing the physical mechanism for varying kinds of recreations. So we saw mountain bikers, we saw ATV, OHV, four-wheel drive, high clearance vehicles. All of that is interfacing and requires the presence of soil in certain shapes, topography, in order to be interesting and fun. And so it's going to get a lot of attention and love, or loved to death, as we say in the industry, as a result of that sort of centrally located value. We're going to move on to water though now, and we're going to talk about water in the same way as we have with our previous resources. We're going to talk about it as a class of resource, and with water we're going to talk about it as flowing water, liquid water, and then also in the cryosphere, meaning frozen water locked up as icebergs, glaciers, that sort of a thing, alpine zone, ground cover, all of that. So without further ado, let's get after it. There's a bit more of a dynamic nature with water than we're talking about with soils, or at least on a much, much shorter time scale. So if you take in forest hydrology or watershed management, you're aware that water as a resource is a much less static feeling, at least on a human perceptual time scale. Soils are much more static seeming than streams, where we can have droughts, we can have seasonally dry washes, so arroyos out west, for example. And with peak flows, not so much in the early winter monsoon season that we have here in the southern Midwest, right? Typically lots of precip and surface moisture, but not in very peaky flows, except for when we get the remnants of a hurricane blowing through here. So, all that to say, think about your national park. Think about where you sit, where the park sits, in terms of, are you on a hurricane path or not so much? And this is not just, I'm on the Florida coast, so I need to worry about hurricanes in my park. Think about places like Iceland. Iceland gets crazy storms that are leftover hurricanes that blow all the way up to the Arctic Circle and still have plenty of energy after ravaging the east coast of the United States, for example, like we've already seen in hurricane season this year. So, we want to think about water as sort of a geographic scale thing. It's like a feature on the landscape. We also want to think about water as a recreation resource on kind of the microscopic or the chemical level, and talk about dynamics at all of those scales and everything in between. Water is absolutely a focus for recreation in the same way that soil is. It provides a surface or a medium in or on which to do the recreation. Of course, wildlife are going to be very heavily tied to the presence, absence, movement of water in your national park as well. Okay? So, water has aesthetic value. It has kinetic energy and material and energy transport value. It has pretty much every functional role that we can think of as humans. We can find that represented in some way. So we've talked about places like Horseshoe Bend in Arizona. So just a matter of hundreds of meters south of the Arizona-Utah border, we have this highly sinuous spot. So there's more degrees of river curvature, per river mile of flow length here than almost anywhere on Earth. And we've talked about how the influence of social media, for example, because water has a powerful draw in terms of recreation and even just scenic beauty appreciation. This is a gorgeous spot. And as you can see, the sun sets directly over Horseshoe Bend. So you see a lot of people doing like wedding photos there, getting those power hour sunset photos, those beautiful, wedding dresses and all that. This place went, in 2005 from a couple of thousand visitors a year to a couple of million visitors a year by about 2015. And that 100% absolutely verifiably tracks with the invention and rise of Instagram and geotagged photos. Right? This is a beautiful spot. It's just past a hill by the one highway through the area. And it is, up until a couple of years ago, there was just like a gravel spot where you could pull off a couple of vehicles and park and walk a quarter mile to this and have it all to yourself. Right? A few thousand visitors a year is a few visitors a day. Right? It's not very much pressure, and you kind of had to know somebody who knew about it to clue you in and say, all right, when you see this like rough gravelly patch at the side of the highway into Page, Arizona, pull off there, just walk over the hill, see what you see. And then we get social media, and everybody with at least a room temperature IQ has access to, hey, just over this hill where you can't see things from the highway is this. And so you go to millions of visitors a year, crowding, people accidentally bumping each other off the cliff and falling hundreds of feet to splat down on the rocks down below. It's chaos there. And so they've had to build kind of an industrial scale. There's like banks of 20 or 30 bathrooms, and you have to pay like $80 per car to get in, which is a lot more than most national parks nearby to enter. An annual pass across the entire United States National Park System for a vehicle of multiple people is $80, right? And so this place is absolutely hammered to death, and sees all those impacts of crowding and conflict that we talked about earlier in the semester, kind of the human and social impacts. This is very much a thing, and it's all based on the fact of water sculpting this feature. And here in Red Rocks country, this is the Vermilion Cliffs area just upstream or upriver from Grand Canyon National Park. This is the Colorado. It's all just predicated on water. And so if water builds it, they will come, to paraphrase the idea from the old movie Field of Dreams. Flowing water also ties in, at least very locally, to another class of resource we haven't really talked about yet, soundscapes. So waterfalls generate, depending on your proximity and the flow rate, or the flux or cubic feet per second going over the lip of the waterfall, either pink, white, or brown noise. And so we'll talk more about this in the soundscape section of the class, but the human physiology is very powerfully wired to respond in positive ways to the sounds of flowing water, to the sounds of waterfalls. So if we have a frequency spectrogram where it's low pitch and high pitch, so high frequency, low frequency sounds, brown noise looks like this, white noise looks like this, and pink noise looks like this. So if you've ever been hiking on a trail, raise a hand if this ends up resonating with you. If you've ever been hiking on a trail and you're hiking towards a waterfall and you hear the waterfall before you round the corner, and it's kind of a low basso rumble, and then you get closer and it's this loud sort of staticky rushing sound, and then you're standing like right next to the waterfall and it's loud and it's high pitched, you're experiencing the frequency shift based on how different frequencies of sound propagate through space and reach your ear from the emitter. Our brains, our physiologies pay a lot of attention to this, right? So if you've ever been studying in the library, not that anybody studies in the library anymore, but had your earbuds or your big super aural head cans on and you're listening to like Mozart study music, some people mix in white, pink, or brown noise to that and experience like better ability to focus, or relax, or concentrate. A lot of people use white noise to sleep, right? So water is closely tied to other classes of resources, and this is a very powerful effect, but it's a very subtle effect. People generally, in my experience, aren't hiking to a waterfall thinking, wow, I can't wait to be bathed in this particular soundscape. This is really gonna, change my alpha versus beta versus theta wave, brain electrochemistry. This is gonna be amazing, right? It's just like, oh no, waterfall cool, waterfall good, let's go splash around, right? So we get a lot of benefits from moving and flowing water, and a lot of risks to the resources, right? So the soils around waterfalls tend to be very, very saturated, soft, vulnerable to impacts. And that's okay, but it is something that we need to sort of factor in. So there is a powerful, this is another way to try to illustrate, there's a powerful affective inside of a human being's thought processes or emotional processes, or even just the physiological underpinnings of thought and emotion in a human. Waterfalls are very, very powerful at getting folks to tap into that. So at places like Iguazu in Brazil, like a lot of forest and outdoor recreation tends to get focused on waterfalls. So has anybody been to any of the waterfalls here in Southern Illinois? Which one? You remember?
Started at Lake.
There's a bunch of
People call it Lake Hippie Hole, and then you keep going up around Lake.
Ferncliff has a bunch. Burden Falls Wilderness. Jackson Falls climbing area, Jackson Falls natural area, which is used for a lot of climbing, has tons of waterfalls, right? And so there's a whole bunch of natural space in Illinois, in southern Illinois, this bluff country that we have sort of nestled in between the Ohio and the Mississippi. And it's not all equally valued, it's not all equally used, it's not all equally visited. Where there's flowing water, in particular waterfalls, man, that place, if you have a waterfall anywhere in your national park, you need to consider it as an attraction site, icon feature, a gravity feature that sort of pulls people towards it. Everybody wants to go to the waterfall, see the rainbows, feel the basso rumble in your chest, etc., right? Like there's a billion examples of cool looking waterfalls. And they tend to be, necessarily tied to interesting topography, right? So Pancake Flat, Kansas, not a lot of waterfalls, not a lot of recreation focused in Kansas. Not that there's anything wrong with Kansas, they just don't have the topography for it. So it's not something that they get to deal with, both the benefits and the impacts of people enjoying waterfalls. God, there's so many of these. Let's just... Multnomah Falls, Yellowstone, Yosemite, or where these are from. This is Iceland.
Washington has a lot of really cool waterfalls.
Washington State has a ton of cool waterfalls. Yeah. But you get the whole thing. So, we want to also couch water as an important indicator resource for what used to be a resource, our stable so-called garden climate of the past 10,000 years or so. So this is an image, I believe, of Ant this is from, but same spot, taken 100 years apart, and the ice wall, the glacier, no longer there. Glacier retreat and extinction is actively underway at places like Glacier National Park, and already catastrophically underway in places like Greenland. That whole island is about to, over the next couple of centuries, really get pretty well wrecked. So we want to, now that we've sort of got the basics, sort of the limbic level look, flowing water pretty, slides out of the way, let's talk about some of the characteristics or attributes of water as a resource that we need to pay attention to for forest recreation management. All right, so one physical property of water is that it is cloudy or clear. And cloudiness is an attribute called turbidity. So you use a device called a turbidimeter with a little quartz glass cell. You grab some water out of the stream or lake or whatever, put it in there, shine a light through, and you very precisely measure how much and if any color change happens to that beam of light passing through that cuvette or little quartz cell filled with your water sample. And if none of the water gets through, if it's very chalky or opaque seeming, that might be natural. It might be totally unnatural, right? So glacial meltwater, where glaciers melt very aggressively in the warmer summer and then freeze again in the winter and acquire fresh snowpack. Those glacial outwash or meltwater streams tend to tumble rocks in them aggressively enough that the rocks are being pulverized, knocked apart, tumbled together, ground into powder. And that suspended powder of rock dust stays in the water column as a colloidal mixture, where some of those particles are so small they can take days or longer to settle out of the water column versus like sand, right? You dump sand in water and it just immediately settles to the bottom. So turbidity can be natural. It can be totally unnatural, like downstream of a trail crossing or an ATV crossing, right? We're liberating a lot of dirt and mud into that waterway, and the waterway picks some of that up and moves it downstream and changes the turbidity of the water. So highly turbid water doesn't let sunlight infiltrate, so it utterly changes the proportion of phytoplankton in larger bodies of water and the presence of things like algae, which are the underpinning or the basis of the food web for all of the other species associated with that fresh water, fresh or salt water. And so it's in that latter case where we have stream crossings, we have river crossings, we have people off-roading with vehicles in the river or down the river or up the river. I was taking water quality samples as an undergrad student researcher in South Carolina in like summer of 2002, and I was like getting a grab sample when I heard an ATV motor come around the bend, and there's a guy upstream in the river going down the river like it's his street, and he's got a bunch of jars of mason jars of moonshine, and so I got to sample that for science and also sample the water quality there. So on a recreational, or in his case an economic basis, right, driving an ATV through a creek is a lot of fun. Like, I get it. But also, there's a lot of impact that happens, right? So he's rolling over and squishing some of the benthic macroinvertebrates, the grubs, the nymph or larval forms of all sorts of different insects that organisms like trout are going to be dependent on. So, turbidity, one characteristic of the water, drives a lot of the health or the productivity of that particular wetland or flowing or marine ecosystem. So, very low turbidity water is highly prized recreationally because it's super cool to hike up the Bear Lake Trail in Rocky Mountain National Park and look into a lake that might be 30 or 40 feet deep, and it looks like it's 3 or 4 feet deep because the water is just that clear. We've all seen those drone videos, right? Where, looks like you're, flying or panning over a puddle, and it's this enormous lake that's 80 feet deep, and you can see right down to the bottom. So again, turbidity is something that recreationists specifically pay a lot of attention to. So high turbidity looks more like that, right? So can any of you guys think of a water body around here that is partially used, among other things, for recreation here in southern Illinois that is highly turbid? And that might even be reflected in the name of that river.
Big Muddy River.
You got it. Gold Star. All right. So, water is also, we can consider it part of our infrastructure, our transportation, our migration corridor network in your national park. Right now, this is kind of an extreme example. This is a very niche use of surface water. We'll play this one more time here for science. All right, so the so-called hydroplaning effect. So let's just take a moment and see if we can just spitball some, resource impact dynamics happening with this right here. So to prime the pump here, no pun intended, we've got hydrostatic shock. When you impact water, water is mostly an incompressible fluid, so the shock wave of that impact propagates outward. This dynamic of water, this kinetic dynamic of water, was used to great effect in the classic cyberpunk novel Neuromancer by William Gibson in the 1980s, where the main character was fighting somebody else, and the other guy was thrown into like a swimming pool. So the main character dropped a grenade in the pool, and the grenade didn't have to be anywhere near the guy. It's just that the shockwave of the grenade exploding underwater would kill anybody anywhere in the pool. So hydrostatic shock from high-speed motor vehicle recreation impacts can kill a bunch of stuff nearby without necessarily the person realizing it, right? So if we come back to the spot and there's a bunch of dead fish floating on the water nearby, we have to at least suspect or implicate that. Other impacts that might be happening here. You see any impacts? Just anybody call it out.
He's definitely impacting the soil.
Yeah, right? So water is the natural resource that is making another natural resource here needing to be managed and protected for recreation purposes. Soil, it's making the soil fragile. All right, so the interaction, the dynamic here between the human, the water, and the soil is unfortunate. Any other? This one's maybe a little bit more subtle. Has anybody ever ridden on a dirt bike, or anybody like riding dirt bikes? Trail bikes? Does anybody know what kind of an engine, internal combustion engine, a dirt bike has versus a car or truck? Two-stroke. Anybody ever worked with two-stroke engines? Do they burn clean or dirty? So dirty, right? So if you have a whole bunch of these, and in some of these larger events, or places like Turkey Bay Off-Highway Vehicle Area at Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area in Golden, Kentucky, that's a whole bunch of partially combusted petrochemicals, all gas and all of its additives, up to a couple of hundred chemical additives in gasoline, just getting sort of lightly misted out over that whole recreation area, and people breathing it and so forth. So not exactly a wonderful thing in terms of the chemical impacts to the water. It's just that it's so much fun. Like, who didn't grow a little chest hair just watching this clip, right? I mean, that's amazing. Now, we've talked about how sand as a soil type, or soil texture, is pretty... It's not that it's resistant to impact, right? And when they're throwing out rooster tails and this stuff, it's that with the next rainstorm, the next windstorm, those ruts are going to get resculpted back into the sand dunes or the shoreline that it is. So not a particularly big deal there. But we do have people sort of emerging. So this is a guy sort of speed running a drainage ditch. These are all over the world. And this is great. Can anybody think of any potential impacts of using water in this way? So water mechanically here is functioning as a lubricant. It's lowering the coefficient of friction between the hull of this kayak, this tandem kayak, and the concrete culvert that they are sort of skimming over and delaminating the bottom of the kayak with a bunch of plastic. Right? What do you think might be any safety risks associated with this? Right, this culvert is not engineered for human recreation use. And so in spots like this isn't even managed for forest and outdoor recreation. This is like behind a bunch of houses kind of thing in some big subdivision somewhere. And so with our modern technologies, things like, monocoque injection molded kayak hulls, our four-wheel drive vehicles, we can very quickly put a human being outside the physical impact and stress tolerance that our bodies can manage, right? So we see a lot of like compression spine fractures when people are doing stuff like this. And it's unfortunate, but like chasing that dragon of the adrenaline rush can get a lot of people to do a lot of things. I'm not saying this ended in disaster. I'm just saying that these guys posting this on social media give some kid who doesn't have a fully developed risk analysis center of their brain developed yet. And that's how we tend to get into issues. So in the protected natural area of your national park, you want to think about water, again, as a very dynamic resource, and not just in water flowing from point A to B, but water actively remodeling the channel in which it is flowing from A to B. So at Yellowstone National Park, the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, is anybody familiar with the wildlife studies that NASA helped contribute to in terms of what was the effect on stream channel, stream morphology, stream shape, river shape, when wolves started to be reintroduced to the Yellowstone in the last couple of decades? It was actually the same kind of dynamic. For those of you who went on our field trip to Ozark Scenic Riverways, we saw a billion little sycamore and elm saplings and seedlings on those gravel bars, and the root wads locking those gravel bars in place. When we hunted wolves out of the Yellowstone ecosystem, the same thing happened with elk out here, except elk out there were budding and topping a bunch of these little trees, and reintroduce wolves, and you see a change in the distribution and number of elk and their ability to browse in these river channels for apical buds. And you could see the change and the rate of change of the river channels in and around the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. You could observe that from space, right? So reintroduce wolves and stream channels start acting like they used to back when wolves and elk kept each other in check, so to speak. Pretty cool stuff. We also want to think about a natural and human potentiated, meaning we add fuel to the fire, potentiated process of wave and wake energy, right? So if anybody's ever been out to the West Coast, like the northern western coast, Oregon, Washington State, there's all these beautiful, lots of Northern California, all these beautiful sea cliffs, dozens or tens of meters tall, and they're just constantly getting edged away by waves hammering against them. And so it sculpts, right, these huge, huge cliffs. Gorgeous, and been around since forever. But this is an actively and dynamically remodeled landscape, right? So it's not a river moving in its channel, it's waves battering against bedrock and resculpting the shoreline kind of continuously. A little nibble here, a little nibble there, big erosion, collapse, subsidence somewhere else. And we have to imagine that same process at a slightly smaller scale, but in places that don't have 20, 30, 40 meter cliffs of bedrock to resist that wave energy or reflect it back out into the ocean. Places like Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge. So every time you run a motorboat through there and you're throwing that sort of wedge-shaped, or that triangle-shaped wake out behind the boat and those waves go sideways until they hit the shoreline and scoop away at the shoreline. So one of the primary reasons that pretty much all of the lakes in Illinois are made by humans. There's like, 5 or 6 natural lakes in the entire state, right? We're just not a lakey kind of a state, not like Minnesota or Maine, someplace like that. Part of the reason that all of these lakes and ponds have a functional lifetime is because we love using them. And we go water skiing, and we go open up the throttle to get to our favorite fishing hole, across the lake somewhere. And we're eating away at the shoreline the whole way to get there, and eating away at the shoreline the whole way back. So wake energy, as a specific human-created form of wave energy, is hugely ruinous to all of these places. So that's why there are very, very strict limits on the horsepower of your motor, the profile or shape of the hull you're allowed to use at different places. When we were at Ozark Scenic Riverways, we were up high on upstream on the river, and we didn't even go to the section of the river where there's no horsepower restriction on the size of your motor, right? So it's anything, and then it's 50 and below, and then it's 40 and below, and then it's 25 horsepower and below, and then 15 horsepower engines only, and then trolling motors only, and then no motor vehicles up above a certain point, and only kayaks and so forth, right? Because this is kind of an invisible thing. You don't see big chunks of soil sloughing off into the water and filling in the stream bed or the riverbed, but it is absolutely happening, and it's happening with every single pass, which means that with that particular impact dynamic, we got to armor up those shorelines with rip-raps of crushed rock, and that changes the thermal profile because crushed limestone is a really bright white color, so it's reflecting a lot of heat energy, and the stone is simultaneously storing a lot of heat energy, so it really changes the local ecosystem. Also, folks can not have to sweat and don't have to paddle. They can just open up the throttle on their cigar boat or speedboat or whatever they're using. Okay? So, when we went to Acadia National Park, we got to see a sea cave called Thunder Hole, which is unfortunately named, but a beautiful place. And we gotta expect that anywhere where the water is at all dynamic, where in this case there's a sea cave connecting this to the ocean further out from the bottom, and so water will boil up at certain times when tide isn't coming or storm energy is whipping up more waves and stuff like that, and it's just like an explosion's going off in there. And so we'll see all sorts of funny videos of people getting caught unawares by stuff like this kind of all the time. This is never not going to be a video, or this kind of video, making the rounds, yeah? And haha, funny, but people get killed all the time from this. People have no idea that this is like a cannon going off underneath you in terms of the kinetic energy involved. Water is very dense. Water is a bent molecule, So it is slightly polar. And what that means is water molecules have weak hydrogen bonds that hold them closer to each other. So in the absence of this, a non-polar liquid like an oil, for example, which doesn't have a charge imbalance across the surface of the molecule, there's no charge imbalances for the positives to get attracted to the negatives and vice versa. There is with water, so water per unit volume is more dense, it's heavier than oil, the same volume. And when you have a dense fluid moving at high speed, it's like a riot cannon. It's like, well, you've all seen hydrojets used to cut things like steel, right? Not hard to do. And we like to put ourselves in these situations because, oh my gosh, it's so much fun. This is going to be such a sick GoPro edit. It'll be fire on my feed. I'll have clout. So, all I had to say, we like to get real close to this stuff. And the fact of geothermal pools, blowholes at the shore, the fact that they are novel, the fact that we don't all have one of these in our backyards and we don't get used to it and we don't get bored of it, means that we constantly are being pushed by our lizard hindbrains to get closer, to experience the truth and the reality of the thing. And a geothermal pool, if it's an actual legit boiling pool, typically has all sorts of heavy metal contamination, not contamination, it's natural concentrations from the surrounding bedrock, and metal inorganic acids can heavily acidify this stuff. And so, like, you know, in Yellowstone, somebody falls into one of the geothermal pools, and, you know, 8 hours later, the ranger staff find out about it, so they go with the pool skimmer thing to try and fish the body out, and the only thing that's left is the foam sole of the person's shoes. Like, their wallet leather got dissolved, their skin, their bones, their teeth, everything just gone, right? That's where people want to go to get that cool summer vacation trip video. And some proportion of the population is just going to get too close or keep backing up too far and fall back into it or what have you, right? This is just constantly an issue. All right, so geysers, other geothermal features. This is a video taken by, or a compilation put together by one of our own former students, just kind of illustrating some of the values of forest and outdoor recreation around water. You may recognize some of these places, right? The draw is here. So we've talked about the joy of movement and the powerful lure of novelty. This isn't something that most of us have in our backyards. So when you are placed in charge of a park that has any kind of a water feature, people are going to go to it, period. And that's okay. But we need to be ready for the reality that some places are just never going to be safe for people, and some people are going to disagree with your assessment of that, and they might be mad at you for having to turn them away or limit the times or weather conditions in which you allow them to access that particular recreation opportunity. Right? It is your job to pre-digest the safety risks and understand what's going on, because it's mostly a bunch of visitors, mostly a bunch of folks who just don't have the chance to understand the risks in a way that you do. So this can feel like you're kind of parenting people, and adults don't like that sensation. So at the end of the semester here, in a couple of weeks, we'll talk about what are some ways that we can sort of effectively communicate this stuff without making people feel like you're talking down to them. Whereas instead, you're looking at the problem together from the same side of the table and asking the question, how can we make this safe and fun for you and sustainable for you and everybody, including me? There you go. All right. Rope swings, skydiving, wingsuit jumping, slacklining, all of these pair pretty nicely with water. And with the advent of social media, this has absolutely exploded. This was not a thing that we really had to wrestle with or grapple with even 25 years ago, right? So within your lifetimes, park rangers are dealing with a whole new generation of ways to experience a space because it's fun to jump out into water. All right. You already know that waterlogged soils are soft. And so pairing soft saturated soils with knobby tires, it's fine. No, this is fine. Drop her down in 4 low and get it, as they say. So the herpetologist, the reptile and an amphibian scientist viewing this video might have a different response to what's going on here versus the person in the cab. And that might be a very different response to what's going on here in the person who's behind the camera. There's a status group dynamic effect of this person is very likely to do things differently. Do harder things, do riskier things, do more impactful things maybe, when somebody else is filming. And you as a park ranger have the inverse effect. You have a calming, you have a steadying, you have a sanifying effect on people with your presence, because people just take that 5 second, that 3 second think of, should I be doing this if Ranger Brandon is watching? Yes, this is fine. Okay, let's do this. Or maybe not, right? So, when we talk in the tactics and so forth section about presence patrolling, this is a primary function, right? You're not telling anybody necessarily to do something or not to do something when you rock up there as the patrol presence. But just the fact of your presence will radically alter everything going on. So, oh God. Let's talk about Carlsbad Caverns as one of our case studies about water. So we've talked about caves as ecosystems, mostly talking about wet caves, so karst geology caves, limestone, chert, stuff like that. Carlsbad is kind of different. It's a drier cave, and it was formed historically by sulfuric acid bath. So when you run basically, millions of years of rainwater through certain kinds of rock, you can pick up strong minerals. So this is sort of the natural form of what's called acid mine drainage from old mines that create these billion-dollar cleanup sites called Superfund sites. This is the natural version of that. Before we had the technical know-how to make sulfuric acids or do deep shaft mining that causes acid mine drainage. And Carlsbad is an amazing spot in an arid part of the country. So there's not a lot of rainwater contributing to things at this point in our climate evolution. And it is a really big cave system. So you guys see the switchbacks dropping down, right? So hardening up the soil surface there. It's a beautiful place. Lots of flowstone, speleothem formations, right? So walls and soda straws and stalactites, stalagmites, and pretty cool stuff. Here's the problem. Caves are extremely fragile ecosystems, right? And one of the big issues at Carlsbad was parking. Because back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, when we were building kind of first-gen national park facilities in and around this space, speleology, the scientific study of caves was a relatively new discipline, and we weren't necessarily thinking in those lines. In the 50s and 60s, we're experiencing a doubling of recreation volume at national parks every 10 years or so, up until the 1980s. Right, so we're going from like 10 million visits, 20 million visits, to 40 million visits, to 80 million visits, decade on decade, right? So rapid growth. So they put in bathrooms, they put in parking lots, and when the drip pan on somebody's car is leaking oil onto that parking lot, or any of the pipes age out of those bathrooms or whatever, those chemicals, either biologically from humans out the exhaust port on a human, or off of the crankcase, transmission, or the oil pan of an internal combustion engine vehicle, right? That's all introduced permanently into the Carlsbad cave system. And so National Park Service, in order to, they can't fix this. This is a permanent impairment of that ecosystem forever. What they can do is stop the additional contribution of more. So they built a very special kind of parking lot with a completely impervious surface. So none of that stuff is able to seep down through the soil and then down through the bedrock into the cave system. Now it's all caught as above ground flowing time residue rain and immediately captured, and it goes through world-class primary, secondary, and tertiary water treatment for sewage and chemicals. Okay, so it's crazy that the National Park Service has to think along the lines of, like Carbondale, for example, has some of the highest rated drinking water in terms of quality and processing effort of anywhere in the country. That's a thing. We have some radioactive selenium deposits buried at the edge of town, and people are super freaked out about drinking glowing water. Fair. And so Carbondale spent a lot of money, and now we have amazing drinking water. It's weird for us to think about the National Park Service having to do the exact same thing, but it makes perfect sense, right? Each one of these parks, it might be on the order, if you have any of the bigger parks, right? You're running a Carbondale worth of people at all times. 20, 30, 40,000 people on site in various places. That's not at all uncommon at Grand Canyon or any of the other big parks. So that means sometimes we're going to be backcountry rangers way out there and not having to deal with anybody's nonsense or what have you. You know, building trails, patrolling, doing wildlife surveying, stuff like that. Sometimes you're basically like a city manager, depending on your role. So that's okay. So they were able to halt the further pathology of this problem, or spread of disease, chemical disease, so to speak, into this ecosystem. But they also had to, at the human level, not the facility level, really kind of change how things are going. So inside the cave system, one of the most powerful controls, one of the biggest knobs that you can twist as a park ranger, is group size limits. And this is, again, mostly due to that status group dynamics thing that I was just talking about with GoPro videos of, you know, the OHVs mudding and stuff like that. We just act differently as solo hikers versus in a couple or two friends. And both of those groups of one or two act very differently than a group of 15. Right? So a church group acts very differently than an identically sized group of a bunch of, you know, punk enthusiasts out on a field trip. I assume. I don't know. And so forth. So group dynamics are very, very powerfully shaped. There's this amplification effect beyond just adding one more person, because you're adding one person's connections or relationships or perceived status, struggles, or jockeying for position in the social ladder in that group. For each person you add, you're adding that relationship to every other one of the people involved. So it grows more than linearly. terms of the number of dynamics present. So you're trying to impress somebody you think is attractive, so you do crazy things. You want to be perceived as strong or athletic or confident in a rugged natural space, so you climb up on the rocks more and you scramble around and do stuff, right? Those are group dynamics, and the size of the group, again, is absolutely a key determinant of that. In some cases, almost regardless of the kind of group present. So, school field trip versus friends versus like a Greek letter organization group of folks. The bigger the group, it just gets more impactful. So, a hard ceiling of 4 to 10, right? That's not a very big group. And if you think about the kinds of groups that are going to a place like Carlsbad, there might be Greyhound buses filled with up to 80 people at a time. International tour groups organize trips to places like Carlsbad, and they'll fly into San Francisco, bus out to Carlsbad, or fly into Dallas, whatever, and do these things and show up 80 at a time, and you have to break them down into smaller groups and move them through these cave environments. As the much smaller groups, the energy, the difficulty is much more sustainable with that. Okay. In specialized environments, permitting is absolutely okay. It can be intimidating for if you're wired as maybe a people pleaser to be like, well, I don't want to like come down hard on people as this, this hard-ass park ranger who's trying to tell me what to do or tell me I can't do something because they don't think I know how. In some places, you have to tell people, no, you can't do this because you don't know how. So, merit or skill-based permitting requirements for a lot of parks in Alaska, for example. You have to go to the backcountry backpacking permitting desk and demonstrate to them that you know what to do when you encounter a grizzly bear alone in the backcountry. Are you carrying a firearm? Are you carrying an electric fence? Are you carrying bear spray? Are you any of the other bear deterrent methods? Do you have bear-resistant food containers? Do you have the skill to set up your cook area hundreds of meters away from where you're camping so that the food fumes and smells aren't associated with you sleeping overnight? Does that make sense? Right. So in less sort of safety critical situations, you can put all those things on like the fine print on the backside of the permit and be like, all right, here's your permit, here's the sites you can go to, have a great trip, just make sure to read the back of this thing, just, we want to be respectful and safe around the bears, and so forth. And in places where safety is much more of a critical concern, you can quiz people, you can turn them away, right? Because if you don't, you're going to be out on body recovery missions, and you have to sacrifice the bear in the case of grizzlies. Just so that the bear cannot acquire a taste for human flesh. Right? For anybody who saw the movie Grizzly Man, that's exactly how that turned out. So, this is a thing, and it is okay to do that when you need to. It's uncommon, but typically the safety issues are so glaringly obvious to anybody thinking about it, really, that it's justified, and generally speaking, most everybody who's stepping up to try this stuff has some inkling that they know that they need to know specific things, they need to have specific kinds of equipment and skills and so forth. Okay? And caves are very limited access, limited space environments, right? The physical carrying capacity of a cave is very, very small. So that's okay to limit those permit trips down to very, very exclusive or competitive things. All right. We'll skip the photo gallery. We'll just demonstrate. Trigger warning, this doesn't end up well. So to the observer, it looks like the guy just turns sideways. But y'all, water that is ankle deep, about 3-4 inches deep, and flowing fast, more than a couple miles an hour, is absolutely strong enough to pull you off your feet and drag you downstream to your death, right? That's all it takes. 2, 3, 4 inches flowing fast. Okay. Now think of any streams that you've crossed. Did they ever get more than 3, 4 inches deep? Right. So this is a particular skill we need to observe and a dynamic of flowing water that we need to address when we go on summer camp, for example. For students who backpack in the Pemigewasset Wilderness area, they're crossing streams not like this, but fast and flowing and easy to munch on an ankle. Very easy indeed. All right, moving on. Okay, so this is a video at Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And that is a high slope environment. So overland flow in Great Smokies, which receives a lot of rainfall every year. That's all it takes to take all of your hard work, all of your trail surface that you brought in with a dump truck, and you spread around either with a rock pack or wheelbarrows or whatever. Right? Just rain. Like, we don't even think of rain as that destructive in a place like Great Smoky Mountains National Park, but every raindrop is going to impart that energy, and all of that energy transfer, to the extent that it moves anything, is always going to move that stuff downhill. So let's talk about a physical erosion process of both wind, which is a fluid, and water, which is a fluid, called saltation. Let's say we've got a sand dune viewed from the side, and you have wind blowing this way from right to left. When this wind gust hits this particular sand grain, it's going to dislodge that sand grain, right? We've all seen dust storms. Anybody ever been to the beach or sand dunes when there's high wind and you can feel the sand hitting your skin and stuff like that, right? The fluid picks up the particle, the soil particle, and just liberates it. Kind of flings it into the air. So, let's say the particle, the soil particle, the sand grain, is going to go like this, or it's going to go like this, or it's going to come out of the board like this, or into the board back that way. The wind, with equal energy, can push the grain up the sand dune just a little bit. Or if it knocks it and the sand grain, rebounds off of the sand dune, it can drop down quite a lot. But the net migration is for these particles to basically jump up the sand dune, and then the next hop with the same amount of kinetic energy is going to throw it way down the backside of the dune. So we're shaving off a little bit from the front. We're taking what we shave off and throw it off the backside, the leeward side, the sheltered side of the dune. And in this way, the dune marches. Take stuff from this side, put it over here, and after a while, the sand dune has very slowly moved, dune marching. This process is called saltation. Latin for the word to jump. So, in Spanish, saltar en paracaídas is skydiving. Right? Same kind of thing. These sand grains are skydiving, so to speak, for a brief, glorious moment when the wind picks them up. Water's doing the same thing, but with larger particles, because water is much more dense than air. So 1 cubic milliliter, not 1 cubic milliliter, that's redundant, 1 milliliter of water has a lot more kinetic energy to impart to a pebble than 1 milliliter of air has to impart to that same pebble. So just rainfall isn't enough to take your soil surface and just march it down slope by saltation or just overland flow. Okay, so that is water as a resource. Let's take a quick break.